Hello again, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed the opportunity to have a lovely breakfast and to have some discussions with your friends and colleagues in the room. And I must say that this is a fabulous turnout for our Hawke's Oration this morning. Huge number of people. We had to, Kimberly Mackay, who's done all of the work in getting this organised, and thank you to Kimberly, had to keep on ringing the Hilton and saying, we need more room, we need more room. And in the end, they just apparently went like this and said, have the ballroom. So here we are. So thank you all for turning up this morning for our Hawke's Oration, and to Kimberly for all of her work and the work of the committee as well. It's a small but mighty committee of volunteers, all people who are passionate about the public service and what the public service can deliver. But I am now going to hand over to Andrew Metcalf, and I'll tell you a little bit about Andrew. When I was rereading his bio yesterday, he and I have had somewhat parallel paths, somewhat different. We both, both joined the Australian Public Service in 1980. I still remember, because it's linked to my superannuation account, I still remember my AGS number.
Yes.
So I joined there. Andrew he's recently retired from the role as Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and as Australia's Director of Biosecurity, and of course he would be well known to many of the people in this room. I know Lorraine keeps on wanting him to go out and look at labs and things today, but passionate about that area of work. He was Departmental Secretary for 12 years, heading 3 different departments, and I think that's one of the features that we have in our broader public service, is that as senior executives, you are expected to be able to pick up and do different types of work and bring your leadership skills to the fore. And Andrew is testament of that. I think he and I probably did run into each other when I was a hot-headed union official, saying that agreement's not good enough, you must do better, back in my heyday as a union official in the mid-90s. But Andrew's forgiven me for that, I hope. He was in immigration at one point, then Prime Minister in Cabinet, and he was also the Chief of Staff to a Cabinet Minister. So a fantastic background to highlight some of the issues that we asked Andrew to talk about today. Some pretty difficult areas of portfolios, I think you'd imagine, with immigration, but also nothing small in Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, which all of the biosecurity issues there and the well-being of Australia. And of course, for us here in the Northern Territory, really critical that biosecurity is top of our agenda. For his great contributions to Australia, Andrew was appointed as an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2012. He is also, like our fantastic Ken Davies, a Fellow of the Institute of Public Administration Australia. These things are not given out lightly. And they are for exemplary service as a member of IPAA, and Andrew has demonstrated that service over many years. So we've got a lot to learn from Andrew this morning. We feel really honoured, Andrew, that you've come to Darwin for the Hawke's Oration, and of course named after a very long-serving and illustrious Commissioner for Public Employment, David Hawkes. So Andrew will speak for around about 30, maybe a little bit more. Then Nicole Herwood, who is our Commissioner for Public Employment, will then lead a Q&A session where you'll get an opportunity to ask all of the questions that have been burning through your mind, that we will need to put a time limit on that. And then Kimberly Mackay will finalise today, and look out for more things coming to you from IPAA NT. So thank you very much and welcome, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Vicky, for those very kind words of introduction, and thank you everyone for the warm welcome here this morning. It is wonderful to be back in the Northern Territory, a place that's been very much part of my working life, particularly in those immigration and agriculture, but also environment portfolios as well. And it's lovely to see some old friends and colleagues who I've worked with over the years here this morning as well. Can I also associate myself with Vicky's earlier acknowledgement of country and pay my respects to the elders, and of course warmly acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander Australians who are here today. And can I say how delighted I am to be again visiting Larrakia land. I come here today as National President of the Institute of Public Administration, a role that I've had for about a year following my retirement from full-time work in August last year. And it's indeed a great honour to have been asked to give this year's Hawke's Oration, celebrating David Hawke's contribution to public administration and good governance in the Northern Territory. David was Commissioner for Public Employment for 13 years between 1989 and 2001, and was, at his retirement, the longest-serving Commissioner in Australia. He was the driving force behind the creation of the Public Sector Employment and Management Act of 1991, regarded at the time as the most advanced of the new devolved public management models in Australia. And he'll be remembered, perhaps most, as a supporter of sound and innovative HR management policies and practices, and as a strong but fair negotiator in industrial relations matters. In preparing this speech, I've had the opportunity to talk with Ken Davies, who knows David well. And Ken recalled David's very strong commitment to helping others successfully progress their career and to achieving positive results for the Northern Territory community, a person who set the gold standard for supporting others. Indeed, David did not just see the public service as an organisation worth belonging to. He believed that serving the public is indeed a noble cause, and I couldn't agree more. The first oration in honour of David was 22 years ago, and IPAA in the Northern Territory has now created a wonderful tradition and indeed created a body of reflections and opinions from many speakers over the years. Looking back over previous orations, you've heard from academics, journalists and social commentators and political leaders. And I see that in 2012, the oration was given by one of my old bosses, Professor Peter Shergold, AC. I was the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet between 2002 and 2005, including when Peter was Secretary. And we worked together through that time on many issues of national and international significance. Peter also championed the need to occasionally have fun at work. And our PM&Z executive team's rockstar performance at the 2004 Christmas party, in our after-hours personas as the Blues Brothers and the Soul Sisters, and in the admiring presence of John Howard and Mrs. Howard, is the stuff of legend in Canberra. Well, at least that's a few of us who were there remember it, but we had a great night. Colleagues, on a much sadder note, can I take this opportunity while I'm here in Darwin today to briefly mention the recent passing of Luke Bowen, who, as the Chief Minister has said, was one of Australia's finest leaders in agriculture. I had the pleasure of working with Luke in several roles over the last decade, but particularly when he was a senior executive in the NT Department of Agriculture, when we faced issues together such as the impact of COVID on our primary industries and the threats posed by the spread of lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease into Indonesia. Luke was tireless. He was a wonderful, remarkable champion of agriculture in the Northern Territory and more broadly across Australia. Indeed, you could see that his heart was in the Territory. Amongst his many achievements, he contributed greatly to Commonwealth and Territory work on all of those issues, and he was much more than just a work colleague. He became a friend to many of us. I, and I know many other colleagues, will miss him greatly, and I've extended my sincerest colleagues to Tracy and her and Luke's family and many close friends. Ladies and gentlemen, I grew up in Toowoomba in Queensland in the 1960s and 70s. And as a child back then, I roamed far and wide over the bushland of the Toowoomba Range. Hopefully some of you know it. learning about and coming to love the extraordinary diversity of animals and plants, but never really thinking about or learning about the people who'd been there for tens of thousands of years before that, or at least tens of thousands of years before the mid-19th century. My family has great pride in our Australian history of Irish settlers who came to Australia, to Tasmania in 1829, and of my maternal grandfather, who was a stockman for the legendary cattle baron Sir Sidney Kidman. And indeed, my wife can trace back to not one but two First Fleet ancestors. But while growing up, I and all my mates, we knew nothing of the First Peoples of Australia, apart from occasional references at school about the Aboriginal tribes who might have met the First Fleet of Bennelong, or who assisted European explorers of the land. Because there were no Indigenous Australians living in Toowoomba, or if there were only a very few. And that's because they'd been sent elsewhere. And we were never taught about their part and their family's part of Australia's history, and that they represented the longest continuing culture in human history. We didn't know any of that. And it's only now, so many years later, that I understand what really happened on that land where I played and lived and roamed around as a kid. What I now know, courtesy of some research, a lot of research being done, is that the Jagera, Giabal and Jarawar people lived on the Darling Downs for at least 40,000 years before European settlement. Well over 1,000, probably closer to 2,000 generations of people. Estimations place the Indigenous population pre-European settlement from 1,500 to 2,500 people. In 1927, the Darling Downs was discovered by Alan Cunningham, and 13 years later, Patrick Leslie and his party began the first wave of European settlement. The settlers not only brought with them cattle and sheep, they brought with them diseases like smallpox and influenza and measles, and these were devastating to the Indigenous population. These introduced diseases, as well as social disruption, relocation, and on occasion murder, caused the Indigenous population of the Darling Downs to be almost wiped out by 1870. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Aboriginal survivors of frontier violence were under the absolute control of the Queensland government. The widespread mindset of the time was the belief in white supremacy, and so the Europeans felt that they knew best when it came to the lives of Indigenous Australians. And in a move to separate the Aboriginal people from the whites, they would be moved from their traditional lands for virtually any reason and relocated to reserves and missions set up throughout Queensland designed for their containment and control. Arbitrary relocation could occur to any Aboriginal person, but children, more so orphans and single mums, were especially vulnerable. These removals resulted in the breakdown of many regional affiliations and families, tearing people away from their traditional values and way of life. I won't continue to quote from the histories as they progress through the 20th century, but of course they continue to the stolen generation, to the landmark Mabo High Court case, the legal dismissal of the original concept of terra nullius, and of course to the recognition of native title. And finally to the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now colleagues, I don't know how many people have actually read the Uluru Statement, and I won't repeat all the words here. But I do just want to read the final sentence. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. So as an Australian who loves this country and is proud of my family's almost 2 centuries here, but one who grew up largely ignorant about the culture and civilisation and sovereignty over millennia of the first Australians who lived on this land, can I simply say how extraordinary that statement is. The extraordinarily generous offer to walk together for a better future. There is still so much more for all of us to do to make that happen and for it to become a reality. Colleagues, I've been asked to talk today about navigating through tricky times as a public servant and about how to survive and thrive in uncertain and complex times. It's probably a truism to say that all times are uncertain and complex, and that they usually are indeed tricky. World events, global forces ranging from advances in technology to climate change, political, economic, environmental and social issues and attitudes in Australia and locally, expectations about the roles that governments and public officials can play. The list goes on and on. Times sure are tricky and complex. And when you add in the speed of communication, the use and impact of social media, the advantages and problems of artificial intelligence and other new technologies, and the changing mores of society added to that complexity, well, we certainly do live in interesting times. And indeed, that well-known ironic phrase, "May you live in interesting times," has its own tricky and complex origins, so I thought I'd find out a bit about it. While widely thought of as a Chinese curse, the closest researchers can attribute it to Chinese is through the expression, "better to be a dog in times of tranquility than a human in times of chaos," originating, according to Wikipedia at least, from a 1627 short story by Feng Menglong, Stories to Awaken the World. And while there are various theories as to its use in modern English expression, I'm attracted most to a statement made by Joseph Chamberlain in 1898 while he was Britain's Secretary of State for the Colonies. And he said, "I think that you will all agree that we are living in most interesting times. I never remember myself a time in which our history was so full, in which day by day brought us new objects of interest, and let me say, new objects for anxiety." So my proposition here today, of course, is that there was nothing particularly special about 1898 for Joseph Chamberlain, and that all times are interesting, and that we as public servants are thus always destined to work in interesting times or tricky times, and we always will. So how can we survive and maybe even thrive? My own experience in almost 4 decades as an Australian public servant brought me directly into many situations of complexity and uncertainty. Many were challenging. Some were high profile and of great media interest. But many did not attract public interest or notoriety, but simply represented the day-to-day work of ethically leading large organisations, of seeking to respectfully interact with ministers and their staff, doing all I could to help implement the law, to provide services to our clients and to the wider community, and to advance the government's policies and programs. Indeed, the role that many of you, probably almost all of you here today, continue to play every day. So I'd now like to talk a little about the particular experiences that I've had to illustrate some key issues from which I've learned over a long career. And I'm often asked in forums like this about what shaped me as a public servant. And I can answer by saying that there are actually quite a lot of key influences, and I'll try and list some of them here now. Firstly, a training in and resultant deep respect for the law, particularly administrative law. Second, a good understanding from both my high school studies and my university studies of Australian and state government institutions and public policy issues. Third, a keen interest in current affairs. Fourth, early exposure as a public servant to elected officials and their staff, particularly through my role as a parliamentary liaison officer in the Brisbane office of the Department of Immigration in the early 80s, and later experiences working quite closely with a number of ministers when I was a mid-level and more senior public servant. Ministers from both sides of politics, such as Chris Herford, Robert Ray, Jerry Hand and Philip Ruddock. And then later, as a Deputy Secretary and then as a Secretary, I worked with many portfolio ministers and indeed 5 Prime Ministers. Fifth, early and frequent involvement in direct provision of services to the public, particularly with visa and citizenship applicants and their families and supporters. And this naturally brought with it an understanding of the direct impact that public servants and their decisions can have on people's lives and livelihoods. Sixth, a strong understanding of the importance of teams, of working with others to deliver good results and to have a shared understanding of what we were there to do and to build on the strengths of each person to make the overall effort much better. Now, folks, I'm certainly not a micromanager, but I came to realise that intuition, gut feeling, is important. Trust your instincts. If there's a little niggle there, don't ignore it. Act on it, find out if there's a problem, and if there is, do something about it. I also came to understand the power of organisational culture, of how we do things around here. Culture is critical, and leaders must establish clear expectations of ethical behaviour and demonstrate that in each of their own actions. In other words, to set a positive culture, not a negative culture. I recognise that we're all human, and I've seen firsthand that sometimes humans can make mistakes. But if you make a mistake, you must do something about it. You must tell people about it, and you must do something to fix it. The sacking offence, in my view, is not making a mistake. It's not fixing a mistake, or even worse, much worse, of covering it up. Learn from your mistakes. Don't repeat them. Don't ignore them. Don't forget them, and never, ever try to cover them up. And finally, I learnt that talking things over with colleagues, friends and mentors is incredibly important. You always make better decisions and avoid bad ones when you've discussed them and sought other people's views. And diverse backgrounds and experiences make this advice much richer. There are many situations that I've faced during my career that could illustrate some of those tricky situations faced more generally by public servants, and I'd like to share just three with you today. The first relates to a specific individual and how much impact government decisions can have on people's lives, on how much decisions had on her life and on the lives of families. The second was about organisational failure and the subsequent repair and reform efforts. And the third relates to regulatory activities and illustrates the need for strong and trusted stakeholder relationships. So one very direct and personal experience that I had was seeing the impact that decisions by public servants can have on people's lives. It occurred when I was the Acting State Director of the Department of Immigration in Melbourne in 1989. I won't mention the names of the people involved, but their situation was front page news over several days back then. The headline in the Herald Sun read, "Tug of Love." It involved the adoption of a baby girl from overseas. The laws that govern those arrangements were both state laws around suitability of parents to adopt and Commonwealth laws, particularly the Immigration Guardianship of Children Act, which regulated the status of children coming from overseas to be adopted in Australia. Until the adoption order was finalised, adoptive children from overseas were formally wards of the Minister of Immigration. However, given that the laws about the suitability of the parents were state laws, the long-standing arrangement was that immigration ministers delegated their guardianship powers to relevant state children's services officials. And in this particular case, there were a series of decisions by state officials in Victoria that led to two different sets of parents being given custody and then disputing each other's custody of a baby who've arrived from overseas under the intercountry adoption program. The first that the Department of Immigration knew about any of this was when the Minister, Robert Ray, received various applications to appear before the courts. And ultimately Robert Ray decided that the only way to resolve the situation of two sets of parents both thinking that they should have custody of the child, the only way to resolve it was to appoint an expert panel to advise on the single question of what was in the best interests of the child. The panel advised which family should be placed with, and the Minister acted on that advice. And the advice was that the baby should be returned to the first set of parents that she'd been placed with. He then asked that to give effect to his decision that I, as the Acting State Director, and accompanied by two social workers, should go out into the Melbourne suburbs and take the baby from the second set of parents and return her to the first set of parents. And we did that one cold afternoon back in the autumn of 1989. I had to hold that little baby girl in my arms in order to take her from one set of parents, surrounded by the family who were losing her and friends and neighbours and television crews who were, to say the least, very angry at what was going on. And then later that day I cradled her again in my arms after we'd taken her down to the other set of parents on the other side of Melbourne to be surrounded by family and friends who were exuberant that their little girl had been returned to them. Now that little girl's now 35 years old, and I can honestly say that afternoon in Melbourne is one of the hardest things I've had to do, and I could see firsthand how what we do and decisions that we make impact not just on that individual but on the families around her as well. And it reminds me constantly of the solemn duty that we have as public officials to undertake our work lawfully and with empathy and understanding and in a fair and reasonable way. On the 18th of July 2005, just over 16 years after that cold Melbourne day, I was appointed by John Howard, as Prime Minister John Howard, as the Secretary of the Department of Immigration and Multicultural and Indigenous Affairs, following the tragic cases of Cornelia Rao and Vivian Alvarez, and indeed following the cases of many other people who'd been unlawfully detained by the Immigration Department. Even though she was an Australian citizen, Ms Alvarez was of course not just misidentified and wrongly detained, she was unlawfully deported. And when realisation of that dreadful mistake came some years later, and that came to two middle-ranking officials in the department, they failed to do anything about it. Indeed, they covered it up. Ultimately, of course, it all came out. The period leading up to my appointment in July 2005 was a deeply bruising time for the department, and its failures regarding those unlawful detention and other acts. And they were highlighted in major reports by the former Australian Federal Police Commissioner Mick Palmer and the former Chief Commissioner of the Victorian Police, Neil Comrie, as well as the Commonwealth Ombudsman. And as the new Secretary, I had a very strong mandate, indeed a very strong expectation for organisational and cultural reform. For me, that time following my appointment as Secretary was about restoring the government's and public's confidence in the department through developing, implementing and embedding a positive cultural change agenda, and by taking actions that would substantially improve performance and definitely prevent a repeat of those tragic mistakes. So we carefully analysed the Palmer report and deduced that it provided three key themes for the future. Essentially, what the report said was that the Department of Immigration had to become open and accountable. It needed to be engaged positively with accountability bodies. It needed to ensure that it was being open in its communication and not seeking to hide things. It had to have fair and reasonable dealings with clients, which doesn't mean saying yes to everyone, but it means listening to people and making a proper decision based upon the law and communicating that properly and providing review rights and other mechanisms if people are entitled to them. But doing so in a way that at least gave people a chance to have their story heard. And finally, it had to have staff who are well trained and well supported, because one of the key issues highlighted in those reports was the failure of technology systems to actually assist staff to do their job properly. My task and that of my new leadership team was to create an integrated department united by its common historical purpose of helping to build Australia and build the Australian nation through people, and by sharing a common culture based on the Australian Public Service values and code of conduct, as well as our own departmental specific business values. This period was the beginning of a journey to drive and integrate the reformation of the department through a values-based culture. My leadership team and I were also concerned to ensure that all staff had a much greater appreciation of our actions and decisions on our clients. Back then we didn't call it a customer-centric approach, but that's probably what you call it these days. Because after all, this had been a department that misapplied, misunderstood or avoided its own legislative regime and had taken wrongful actions in relation to many people with disastrous consequences. Decisions by migration officers can have profound implications for people as simply whether they are allowed to be in Australia or not, whether their family can be with them or whether they can become an Australian citizen. So for the first time in the department's history, I created the role of a Deputy Secretary for Client Services. And we constantly drove home the message that we were there to lawfully implement our legislation, but also to provide services to people. One way of doing this and trying to help shape understanding and culture was through a whole series of workshops facilitated by independent consultants. Workshops where actual clients of the department were asked to recount their experiences with the department. But what made these workshops quite powerful is that sitting behind those clients were departmental officers, senior, middle ranking and junior. And they were forced to listen to what was being said, to hear what people thought about how we'd actually handled their application or how we interacted with them. It was a pretty new experience and a pretty profound experience for people coming away and our staff coming away and saying, I just didn't realise that that's what people thought about us. A key question for any successful change process is how to sustain change over time. It's one thing to have an initial rush of enthusiasm, but quite another to genuinely change an organisation, ensure that change endures beyond the tenure of a particular leader or set of leaders. The success of a change agenda also lies in the ability of leaders to communicate their claims effectively, to engage with all the employees in the journey, to make this a shared experience, to ensure that people understand the reasons for the change and ultimately to own that change themselves. So one-way communication from the top is useful, but it's not enough. Actual and effective two-way engagement is what's required. Leaders need to listen much more than they speak, and their actions, of course, speak much louder than their words. This change and reform program in the Immigration Department required involving our people and key stakeholders and accountability bodies such as the Human Rights Commission and the Ombudsman in each step of the journey, and actively harnessing their own goodwill and creativity as part of that journey. So a couple of years later, in 2007, the then Ombudsman, Professor John McMillan, released a report entitled 10 Lessons Learnt, which basically summarised the lessons learnt from the various reports that the Ombudsman had made about the many, many wrongful detention cases. And I'd like to read them out because these remain absolutely relevant today. The 10 lessons were to 1, maintain accurate, comprehensive and accessible records. 2, place adequate controls on the exercise of coercive powers. 3, actively manage unresolved and difficult cases. 4, heed the limitations of information technology systems. 5, guard against erroneous assumptions. 6, control administrative drift. Don't let things just drag on. 7, remove unnecessary obstacles to prudent information exchange with other agencies and bodies. 8, promote effective communication within your own agency. 9, manage complexity in decision making. And 10, check for warning signs of bigger problems. So John McMillan and I actually jointly launched that report at an IPAA event, and I suggested that in fact there was an 11th lesson, the need for a strong and positive culture and values base for public officials. Colleagues, my simple plea here today is that we must not forget those lessons of the past. They were not and are not exclusively applicable to the Immigration Department of 20 years ago. Anyone working in public administration could and should usefully continue to refer to that Ombudsman's report and to apply those lessons. And indeed, I believe that if the 3 Palmer Report themes of being fair and open, having open and accountable, being well developed and supported staff and being fair and reasonable, if you add those together with the Ombudsman 10 themes, they could well be a useful control template for all major government programs and initiatives. And if they were, then many mistakes, indeed many abuses of power, and many resultant tragedies would never occur or have occurred. My final short case study here today is much more recent and which has and continues to have a very direct relevance for the Northern Territory. And it relates to the emergence or re-emergence in Indonesia in recent years of 2 major animal diseases, lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease. Either, if introduced to Australia, would have massive implications on our livestock industries, our rural communities and our food security. Lumpy skin disease is transmitted by biting insects and could potentially be brought to Australia by natural pathways. Foot and mouth disease could potentially be brought here through infected animal products or through people if they had contaminated clothing or footwear. And so the arrival of FND in Bali and the arrival of lumpy skin disease in Indonesia meant that there was a very major and justified alarm about the potential presence of those diseases coming to Australia, and particularly here in the north. And it meant that collectively the Australian government and state and territory governments and many other people had to do everything possible to keep those diseases out. And should they ever get here, to ensure that they were detected very rapidly and able to be dealt with very rapidly. So we had a very clear purpose. My former department, the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, is the biosecurity regulator for the Australian border and has a major policy, operational and coordination role. And as Secretary of the Department, I was Australia's Director of Biosecurity, pursuant to the Biosecurity Act 2015. A key feature of our biosecurity arrangements are that they are integrated nationwide, with many organisations having a role to play. The Australian Chief Veterinary Officer and their state and territory counterparts, the various departments of agriculture, the Australian Centres for Disease Preparedness, the Centre for Excellence in Biosecurity Risk Analysis, other border agencies, international organisations, and the governments of Indonesia, Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea all had government-level responsibilities. Industry associations such as the Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association, the Australian Cattle Council, Meat and Livestock Australia and many others were all critical in providing advice and helping to facilitate activities on the ground. And many other players, particularly airlines and airports and the travelling public, had key roles to play as well. So successfully mobilising such a large and diverse network required, in my view, exceptional public service. Leadership and collaboration was demonstrated in very real ways by the then Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, Murray Watt, and his counterparts in the states and territories, as well as the leaders of the cattle and our other livestock industries, and my department and our counterparts. We had a very clear purpose. We had a very clear common goal, simply to prevent the disease from coming to Australia. And we addressed that problem by building on long-standing and trusted relationships, such as the ones we had here with the late Luke Bowen. And we made those relationships even better. And perhaps, but not always, we stayed pretty calm. To date, so far as we know, we're successful. But you can never be complacent. I must admit that the burden of responsibility that I had as Australia's Director of Biosecurity was something that I felt keenly every day and every night. Colleagues, much has been written and said about public administration in Australia in recent years. The online newspaper The Mandarin recently celebrated its 10th anniversary and published a very informative series of articles about developments in public administration over that decade. On a Commonwealth level, the occasionally but increasingly adversarial, sometimes point-scoring nature of Senate estimates hearings has drawn public officials into the spotlight far more than 2 or 3 decades ago, and similar occurrences have occurred in our states and territories. And very properly, across our jurisdictions, egregious cases of maladministration have been exposed and pored over in great detail by Royal Commissioners, by Ombudsmen, by Auditors General, by anti-corruption bodies, the media, and the like. Indeed, an outsider looking at Australian public administration in 2024 and only referencing media articles would probably quickly conclude that we're beset by poor administration, that we're sometimes corrupt, we sometimes make dreadful mistakes and do nothing to fix them, that we don't really care about the people that we ultimately are meant to serve, the Australian community. And some of that is sadly true, and some quite dreadful things have been allowed to occur. But the reality is that overwhelmingly 2 million or so public officials in Australia wake up every day determined to do the best they can to service their communities, and they do so with pride in their work. They do this by providing services and advice to the government to help their organisations work well and efficiently, and services to the entire Australian population. And the sheer breadth and depth of what our public officials do is almost breathtaking. So managing in tricky times requires us to learn from our mistakes, but also to learn from what's gone right. And here in the Northern Territory, there's much work being done by public servants on behalf of the government to serve its community. Let me just highlight a few of the programs and activities recognised in recent years through the Chief Minister's Awards for Excellence in the Public Sector. And these are drawn from literally dozens of nominees and winners just in the last few years alone. One of the 6 award categories is making the Northern Territory a better place to live. And last year, Laramba Water Treatment Plant, Improving the Health of a Remote Community, was the award winner, a program delivered by Indigenous Essential Services and the Department of Territory, Families, Housing and Communities. In 2022, the Award for Excellence in Cross-Government Collaboration and Partnerships was given to the Department of Corporate and Digital Development and NT Health for their work on Acacia 1.0, transforming patient centre care in the Northern Territory. And in 2021, the award for the category of Excellence in Human Services Delivery went to NT Police, Fire and Emergency Services for their Emergency Operations Centre COVID-19 response. And last week in Canberra, IPAA ACT's Spirit of Service Award showcased many examples of excellent public service through collaboration between departments and agencies, through innovation, through learning and through community development. Did you know that as a result of some great work being done by Services Australia, the Department of Finance and the Attorney General's Department, that we can now all use MyGov to create a Commonwealth statutory declaration using one's own digital identity to replace the need to go out and find a JP somewhere. And that the Australian Taxation Office now has an online learning platform to help small business owners master their taxation and superannuation obligations. There are many, many other examples of how Australia's public sectors are helping drive positive changes to benefit the Australian community. So to sum up, I trust that it seems clear from what I've said today that times will always be tricky, but also that it's indeed possible to successfully navigate them. A strong ethical framework and strong ethical practices are fundamental to this success. Mistakes have been made by Australian public servants and they've sometimes brought enormous human or financial cost. And we must learn from those mistakes and from maladministration. We must remember our mistakes and we must train our people and put systems and checks and scrutiny arrangements in place to prevent them, and we must quickly acknowledge them if they occur and fix them. But usually the public sector does its job well, and often very well, as exemplified by your Chief Minister's awards. I firmly believe that our nation's public services are key parts of our national infrastructure. They are key contributors to the success of our country, and that overwhelmingly our public servants and other public sector employees are good, honest, hard-working and able people committed to pursuing that noble cause of serving their community. Therefore, it's a real privilege for me, following my long career as a public servant, to now be the National President of the Institute of Public Administration Australia. And in my view, the one thing that unites all our public services across Australia is that we're required to, that we want to operate lawfully and according to strong and positive values. Our public servants are here to serve democratically elected governments and to help them lawfully govern and to implement their policies and programs, and thus to serve our communities. The Institutes of Public Administration across each Australian government and our national organisation are the professional bodies for our public servants. An old-fashioned word would be to describe us as guilds. We believe that amongst our other activities, and in the light of recent events, we need to do even more to help build a very strong ethical framework, to provide very strong ethical guidance, such as the guidance provided in public service legislation. And that we need to extend that not just to public servants, but all actors in the public sector, whether they're employed under a Public Service Act or adjacent to that system. And we must remember the lessons of the past and to ensure that the next generation of public servants does so as well. To quote from George Santayana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. IPA's work in this area will complement the work of the Australian Public Service Commissioner, the Northern Territory Commissioner for Public Employment and their counterparts in other jurisdictions. And as an institute, we'll also look to influence further afield in a broader construct of the public sector that always acquits itself with integrity in everyday actions. You'll hear more from us in the months ahead. And I'm sure that what we will do is something that will embody the wonderful contributions made by past leaders, such as David Hawkes, and indeed to add to his and their legacy. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a privilege to be here with you today and to present this Hawkes Oration. Can I wish you, each and every one of you, all the very best for the future. Indeed, I trust that you will survive and indeed thrive in the many interesting and tricky years ahead as you continue to pursue the noble cause of public service ethically and well, as exemplified by David Hawkes. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your very informative and interesting perspective on surviving and thriving in tricky times in the public service. Definitely a topical issue for all of us in the room today as we're working through quite a substantial machinery of government change with the new government. Also, thank you for acknowledging Luke Bowen's contribution. I think many people in the room would appreciate your acknowledgement of his contribution at the national level and also as he did here in the Northern Territory. Perhaps we could all just give Andrew another round of applause for his excellent presentation this morning. Many of us in the room also would acknowledge David Hawkes as a great and trailblazing leader here in the Territory, certainly as Commissioner for Public Employment. I'm often reminded as he is definitely the benchmark and certainly somebody to aspire to be, to contribute to the Territory's public service like. And you, as you shared in your address, you know, he talked a lot about the public service being a noble cause. Could you share with us about what kind of attracted you to be a public servant, and maybe did that change for you as you progressed through your career?
Yeah, it was pretty simple. I was really bad at maths at school, and I was able to take an alternative subject to advanced maths. I had to do basic maths, but there was an alternative subject on offer at the school I went to called citizenship education, and it was really about teaching you about government and, you know, the layers of government and the institutions of government, and we had to, I've still got the folder somewhere or other, we had to sort of analyse a news story. They were pretty riveting things from the Toowoomba Chronicle in the 1970s, and a bit like the NT News, I suspect, and that sort of got me interested in government and how nations run. And then when I went on to university, I did arts law and didn't really like law. I thought I was going to be a lawyer, but I didn't really like law. But I did art subjects that were mainly around public administration and government and public policy and political ideology. And by about second year, I was getting several classes taught by a person who's now a professor, Ken Wiltshire, who was at Queensland University, he's now an emeritus professor now, and he brought great energy and passion to public policy because we basically had the Harvard method of teaching of case studies, and we were sort of required to research things and then present, and that got me really interested in what governments do and how the public sector can affect positive change. And so law was sort of there as a backdrop, but I really loved public policy, and that's what got me in ultimately to applying for public service jobs. I ended up finishing that law degree only because my wife was also doing law, and she was far better than me, and she had a really good set of notes that I could use. And it actually did help me along the way, particularly administrative law. But I was really lucky to have some opportunities to understand the power of government and how, if used well, it could make a really positive difference. So,
you've had a long career as a public servant, as you've mentioned, and interacted with various ministers and their advisors. Obviously, many of us are forging new relationships and with ministers and a new government. Can you give us any tips on what worked well for you in those relationships, and maybe some of the things that we might not want to do? Yeah,
look, the not want to do's are pretty obvious. It's always difficult with a new minister, and particularly, if the new minister has new staff, and if you have no relationship with them prior, sometimes you will have a relationship prior. And just on that relationship in the Commonwealth level is usually forged in Senate estimates and other hearings, which can be pretty adversarial. But I think with respect to members of Parliament and senators from both sides, when they come to government, they tend to leave a lot of that behind and are prepared to make a fresh start. I saw firsthand one of the classic mistakes back in 1996 when I'd actually moved in. I'd been an assistant secretary in the department. I knew Philip Ruddock very well from previous interactions, and he asked me to come over to his office and be his chief of staff. And I saw early on at one occasion where a branch head sort of asked to see the minister and came in and presented to him for signature a whole series of regulations which were implementing changes to visa rules, but visa rules which had been agreed by the previous minister, which the new minister had had no visibility of and had been given no, had no ownership of, whatever. And there was this sort of assumption from this branch head, who should have known much better, that the minister was different, but but that didn't really matter, and far less any expectation that it was a change of government and whatever. So Philip Ruddock was pretty unhappy about this, and I think those papers were still sitting in his office when he left 7 years later, because it just showed you do have to realise where there's a change of government that it is a different government, that it's not the same crowd. The opportunities to forge trusted relationships are really important. Now, Canberra's different to the Territory or the other jurisdictions because ministers fly in and out and are usually only there for parliamentary sitting weeks and whatever. So finding opportunities as a senior public servant to spend time with a minister or their staff can be pretty fraught during sitting weeks because that just gets a life of its own. And so finding opportunities to spend real time with them for people who are very time pressured and very focused on a whole range of things. So I found that if I could spend any time at all on the road with the minister, that was time very well spent. Overseas trips were particularly helpful because you really did spend a lot of time on the road, but even just finding ways to make sure that you were where the minister was and to spend some time with them. So,
good advice, thank you. You talked a bit about owning and learning from mistakes, and that's a really important message for us. Could you share an example for us about where that might have played out in your career and if there was a setback that then you had to recover from?
Yeah, well, there will be plenty. And the mistakes, mistakes can range from a whole range of different things to where there's a straight mistake to where you don't do things as well as you'd like to, type of thing. So I'll share with you a couple of examples. I don't think anyone here will remember it, but there was a particularly controversial case fairly early on in the Howard years when I was Ruddock's Chief of Staff of an American national who came to Australia on an electronic travel authority which didn't require very much processing. He was actually on the blacklist to not be admitted, but used a slightly different name or had a passport issued in a slightly different name that didn't trigger the blacklist. And so first thing we know in the media is that former Black Panther Lorenzo Irvin is sort of giving lectures in Australia, and next thing I know, because Philip was overseas at the time and I was back in Australia, that I had John Howard's Chief of Staff sort of on the phone asking in pretty direct terms, how on earth did this happen? And the mistake was made by very basic technology at the time, and literally Lorenzo Irvin had hijacked a plane and taken it to Cuba, so he really was a fair-on, black urban terrorist. But the department then made a whole series of mistakes, and I wasn't diligent enough, I think, in my role as Chief of Staff to the Minister to be questioning the department about what it was doing. Effectively, the law back then didn't really contemplate that sort of situation of where we may have someone in Australia who we needed to cancel their visa in order to remove them, but to do so in an emergency type situation. And the rules of natural justice replied that you need to write to them and give them 14 days to respond, and this is what the same time that the Daily Telegraph was saying, why is he still here and whatever. Anyway, we managed to work it out eventually, but I look back then and I don't think in some respects I was tough enough in dealing with some of the things that I should have been doing, and I learned occasionally you've got to learn to be a bit tougher than you normally happen to be. The second example, and this isn't a mistake, but it's just a reflection. That very first day that I started in the... sorry, people here can't see us, so I don't know whether we can just pull it. Let's see if that will move. Oh, it's wired in, is it? Yeah, no, okay. That very first day that I started in the Immigration Department as Secretary was it was an incredible day. They were farewelling the former secretary and deputy secretaries, all of whom had been moved. They weren't sacked, but they were moved. Not because they'd done anything wrong themselves, but there was effectively executive responsibility taken. I was appointed to the role, so I wanted to sort of create the impression that, that we were still here and we were going to sort of fix things and whatever. So I went round and shook every hand I possibly could in the department, in the central office of the department. In fact, I was shaking one guy's hand and he said, "You realise that you've shaken my hand 3 times already today?" And he said, "You should remember my name by now." And I said, "Oh, God, I'm sorry." That evening, I had the closest thing to a crisis of confidence I'd ever had. I sort of became overwhelmed by the scale of the task when I sort of read the reports about what had happened and just talking with people through the day about how they actually felt that they were victims as well and all this sort of thing. And I wouldn't describe it as a panic attack, but it was something where I thought to myself, I can't do this. I'm an idiot. I shouldn't have taken this on. I had a couple of colleagues who had come with me to help with the transition, and I rang them both while I was driving home, and they were both pretty well identical in their advice, which was sort of, hang on a tick, you took the job, you knew it was going to be difficult, toughen up and we'll see you in the morning. So they didn't give me much bloody sympathy. I got home and, my wife said, "How'd it go?" And I said, I was almost crying. I said, "I don't think I could do this." She said, "Oh, for God's sake, Andrew, you took it on." Anyway, when I talk about listening to colleagues and listening to friends and talking things over, that's really important. Some of the decisions that I've had to deal with, and I'm sure that many people in this room have got to deal with difficult, tricky issues about correctional services, around entitlements to live in different places, around families and how they're able to be together or not together, about health support. There's so many different things. It's difficult, so I've strayed a bit off the mistake, but I'm basically saying you need to look after yourself and you need to ensure that you're talking with people and getting the best advice so that you can make the best decisions. So
it's really good advice, and I think having networks that you can connect with professionally as well as personally is really important for us all.
Yep.
I might open up to the audience here today to see if anyone's got any questions they'd like to ask Andrew.
There's nowhere to hide in this room, so if you don't put up your hand, then Vicky will come and get it. So.
Mark.
Thank you. Mark Hathaway from the Office of the Commissioner for Public Employment. At least I hope for the rest of the morning, unless I really muck this one up.
Be brave, Mark, be brave.
Be brave. Look, just a comment. The first thing that came through, which I think was a theme going through your talk, was that public service is a noble cause. Another way of expressing that is perhaps a vocation, that there are many people in this room, especially at the higher levels of of the public service, who probably could be in better paid jobs if they were doing similar jobs in private enterprise. Getting back to one of the other points in your talk, in which you quite correctly, I think, emphasised the importance of discussing things with colleagues and using that as a means of avoiding mistakes or correcting mistakes. Of course, you'd be familiar with the concept of groupthink. And sometimes if we're in a circle where we're just talking to each other and not taking information from outside that, we actually can compound a mistake and blow up a space shuttle. So would you like to say something about how you manage groupthink? Yeah,
no, well, you're absolutely right. And so that need for diversity in advice and in fact, I've tried to, I recognise that early on, that the groupthink, and everyone's just reinforcing each other, or people being sycophantic and just trying to say what the boss pleases. You've got to absolutely guard against that and recognise that that's a possibility. So having in the leadership team the person who is trusted and empowered and respected to offer the alternate advice or be the critical friend, so to speak, is important. In recent times, I actually tried to institute that in our departmental executive by including one or two people who are not just the top leadership team, but who came from other parts of the organisation. In my department, agriculture, it was largely the senior staff were almost all in Canberra, but I always insisted, given that the majority of our staff were actually out in the states and territories, our biosecurity officers, to have a regional representative, and that they were empowered and trusted and respected to actually say, hang on a second, that's not going to work. And indeed, I quite often tried to bring in someone who wasn't part of the executive at all, someone from outside, an independent director, so to speak, to be the person who their career wasn't riding on, that they were actually there to say, well, I've looked at all of this and I just don't understand it, or I've looked at all of this and I just don't think this is a good idea, or whatever it happened to be. So you've got to have a culture that allows that to happen, but certainly my own personal experience is that it's essential that you do have it happen, otherwise you do fall into simply, not really opening up thinking as to all the aspects that should be brought to bear on a problem. So, yeah.
Thanks, Mark, for the question. I think here in the Territory too, it's easy for us to think we can run the world from Darwin, and listening to the voices of our regional colleagues and also younger people in the service like graduates is really important as well. Is there anyone else with a question over here maybe?
Hi, thank you. I'm Sophia. I work in the Office of Water Security in the Department of Lands, Planning and Environment. And I had a question on impartiality within the public service. So no matter which part of the political spectrum you are on, I feel there's always things you disagree with. And starting off in my career, I'm just wondering, do you have any advice on how we can deal with being in positions where we might disagree with something?
Yeah. Look, it's one of the key issues about public service is ultimately you are there to be non-partisan and to faithfully, the policies of the day of the government, providing it's lawful. If a government's seeking to do something unlawful, that's another set of arrangements. And sometimes those policies may not be your own personal values or own personal policies. And at the end of the day, you need to make a judgment as to whether you're able to do your job as well as you possibly can, even if there are elements of that you personally disagree with. And if you can't, then you shouldn't be in the job. You should take the honourable course and say, I can't do this. And my suggestion would be, in a big public service, that you would be talking with your supervisors about this ethical dilemma or values dilemma that you have, and ask whether it's possible to move somewhere where that issue is not going to present itself as a problem for you, or whether you simply say, I can't remain in the public service. Because you do have to disassociate yourself and any particular personal views you may have with the fact that this is a democracy. We have a democratically elected government. They have a clear platform. There are laws that we have to administer, and that's what your role happens to be. You're probably everyone here is far too young. I saw Yes Minister when it was first broadcast back in the very early 80s. And in fact, just let me digress, there was a famous joke that it was on 8:30 on a Monday night or something or other, and that the Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, and the head of his department, Sir Geoffrey Yeend, would watch it together in the Prime Minister's office, and that laughter, only the two of them were allowed in the room, they'd watch it together, and laughter was heard coming, but it was different laughter at different times, depending upon whether Jim Hacker was sort of on top or whether Sir Humphrey was sort of in ascendancy sort of thing. So there is a wonderful Yes Minister, and I remember the title of the episode's called The Whiskey Priest, but there's this wonderful homily given by Sir Humphrey to Bernard, the Minister's advisor, about about public service and how different governments change and have different views. And Sir Humphrey says, look, if I believed in everything or opposed everything that governments stand for or don't stand for, I'd be pro-public education, I'd be against public education, I'd be pro-nuclear deterrence, I'd be against nuclear deterrence, I'd be in favour of universal healthcare, I would be out to abolish universal healthcare. In other words, I'd be a stark, raving idiot. And so Sir Humphrey famously said, so therefore I am a moral vacuum. I have no views about anything. It's okay to have views, and I know, and we've seen it play out recently at the Canberra level. Some relatively junior public servants have chosen to go public about their views about the current conflict in the Middle East. And I believe that that's something that they shouldn't do. That you, as a public servant, have to ensure that you're diligently doing your job, and if you disagree with it, and if it affects your job, you should move or you should leave. That's what being a public servant is about. You can't be there. Either it's going to cause a huge crisis of your own self-being, or you'll find that you're not doing the job in the way that you should. So,
Thank you. Probably got time for one more question. If we've got someone in the room. Get your steps up.
Tony Shelley, Chief Minister in Cabinet. Have you got any observations on the robo-debt affair?
yeah, you'll notice it's the one word I didn't mention in that speech, but it sort of permeates it. Look, I'll try to be a bit careful in what I say. I know many of the people. I knew the secretaries involved. I knew the ministers involved. I knew some of the other people involved. The whole thing makes me pretty angry. That on two fronts. Firstly, there certainly does appear in the subsequent code of conduct inquiries appear that people absolutely failed to adhere to the code of conduct, particularly about diligence and about transparency, and this key point about whether the data matching and the averaging of taxation material was in fact able to be lawfully done under the Social Security Act as it then was, and the collective sort of notwithstanding some questioning from parts of social services, the culture that existed in human services with Melissa Golightly and Catherine Campbell, it appeared to be a very toxic relationship between departments and a toxic culture. And as a result, ministers perhaps should have asked more questions, but ultimately the public service failed to make it clear that the better view of the law was that legislation would be required, and given the political view that legislation was impossible to achieve through the Senate, that some other way of dealing with the issue should have been dealt with. So I'm angry about that. And that, I think, is what has come through in the Public Service Commissioner's subsequent Code of Conduct inquiries. But I'm also angry about the fact that it was a dreadful program that clearly didn't work. And it took them years of trying to avoid that fact that these ridiculous debts were being created, that they'd basically reversed the onus of proof. So instead of the Commonwealth having to prove that you had a debt, you had to prove you didn't have a debt. And there was no phone number to ring. And there was no way of sort of disputing this, and all sorts of things were going on, including people being prevented from leaving the country, and then all of the mental health and suicides that occurred. So it was a really dreadful program, and God knows how they could have dreamt it up and then defended it for years, including trying to avoid any actively ensuring that reviews that were occurring were not sort of followed through and that sort of thing. So the whole thing was awful, which is why I say we should remember the lessons of the past and we should not forget them, and that we should test what we're doing against some of those lessons. And if you go back and look at the Ombudsman's 10 lessons from when the Immigration Department managed to wrongly identify and detain 200 people because it misunderstood its own law, or it misunderstood the way that it should be applied, or because they weren't diligent enough, if you applied those 10 lessons, robo-debt would not have occurred. And that's why I think for us as professional public servants, as many here are leaders, I think, in organisations, that concept of stewardship for me is not just about the future, it's about ensuring that the future remembers what we've learnt along the way, so that we have an ethical base to what we do, but we do so with understanding what works and what doesn't work, and that I haven't found a minister. Ministers don't like getting bad news, but when I've gone to a minister with a problem, their response is usually, how do we fix it? And I was telling a tale yesterday to Kate on the way up. I'm aware of at least 2 occasions where I've had two occasions where I've had to go to a minister and say, Minister, this thing that we think we've been doing lawfully, we've now had legal advice to show it's not lawful, or there's a high level of doubt, and we think the only way to fix this problem is through retrospective legislation, because there's no other way it's too big an issue to fix in any other way. Both the government and the opposition have regarded that as a healthy sign of a culture that's prepared to identify mistakes and do something about fixing them. They weren't happy about it, but they were much happier that we did something about it rather than trying to make it go away and hide it.
Thanks, Tony. Really important question, actually. So thank you. So that probably brings us to the end of the question and answer session today. So thank you, Andrew, for your insights and for your honesty and your open dialogue with us. And I'll hand over to Kimberly to wrap up.
First of all, how about a big round of applause? Nicole did a great job talking everyone through. On behalf of the IPAA committee, I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to attend today's Hawke's Oration. And of course, thank you, Andrew, for coming all the way to Darwin to share your experiences and wisdom. And thank you to Nicole and Vicky as well for helping run today's event. For those of you not familiar with IPAA, we're a professional association managed by a small but mighty volunteer committee. Our constitution sets out our objects and purpose, which include to promote the study of public administration and the development of the public services as a profession. For those of you who are not IPAA members, I encourage you to consider joining. The committee has been working hard to increase the value proposition of being a member, and in this regard, our next event is an informal networking meetup for members at the Reserve in November, and if you want an invite, you better join. We've got some very senior persons who are now members of IPAA across all agencies, so it's a great networking opportunity for anyone not at that level yet, whether you're at the beginning of your career, mid-career, or towards the end of your career. It's worthwhile joining. As the committee secretary, I'll also be touching base with all of our members shortly to remind them they have access to the Australian Journal of Public Administration, which is a fantastic resource in relation to public administration, public management, and public policy in Australia. You'll all find some brochures on your table for membership. Feel free to take one. You can also visit the IPAA website or come and catch myself or some of the other committee members to have a chat about joining. That's all from me. Thanks again for coming, and all the best for the rest of your day.
Thanks.